Okay, in this video I want to look at creating materials and material basics, more so material basics, with the mental ray renderer. So what I want to do here first is just come into this ground plane object and go ahead and hide this because I don't really need that for this particular video. And that way when I render the scene, all we see is this material sphere and this little reflection object that I put in there, which is just a cylinder. Now, as you can see by the reflections here on this material, there are two self-illuminated objects here in the scene. And if I switch to a perspective view and rotate around the scene here, what those reflective objects are these skylight portals, sky portal lights, and they have they're visible to the renderer, and I've assigned a CIED shader to these for the color. And what I'll do is just go back to my camera view here. And what I want to look at here again is materials using mental ray. Right now, all the materials here in my material editor are Arc & Design materials. And it comes up that way because of the user interface that I'm using. If you wanted to use a similar interface, what you could do is go to Customize and this Custom UI and Default switcher. Right now I'm using the Design Viz Mental Ray option here, and what that does is it loads up my material editor with Mental Ray materials, these Arc & Design materials. If you didn't want that, you could switch to like the Design Viz material, and as you click on these, it gives you this overview of what exactly is going to happen when you select this default option here. For example, if you select the Design Viz default, the material editor will be populated with architectural materials. That's not the Arc & Design material, that's the Scanline architectural material. It will also, if you go to Max, the material editor will be populated with standard materials. And so again, I'm using the Design Viz as populated with Arc & Design materials, which are the mental ray materials here. That's one thing that I often get questioned about, is because this architectural material versus the Arc & Design material. Again, the architectural material here is a Scanline material. It will render in mental ray because there's a pass-through or code written to where this will be translated and actually render. But I don't recommend using Scanline materials with the mental ray material. Again, you can, and it may work, it probably will work, but I find it to be a little better if we could just replace that with an Arc & Design material and the problems went away. So again, stick to mental ray materials when using mental ray as much as you can. Now with mental ray, you have a lot of material options here, but really it all boils down to just a handful of materials that you'll probably use the most. For example, the most commonly used material will be the Arc & Design material, the one that's populated here in the viewport, or I'm sorry, in the material editor by default, because you can create basically any type of material from this Arc & Design material. So this is like the universal material to use with mental ray these days. This should be where you start from most of the time, and you have templates that you can drop down from here. For example, if you wanted a matte finish or glossy finish. And I will go over some of the settings here, but realistically there's an excellent document that comes with 3ds Max that thoroughly explains what each of these settings do. So I won't go step by step on each and every one of these functions here in the material and this Arc & Design material, because that document does an excellent job of that already. Now, to get to that document, you could go to the help file, and I'll just take the shortcut and go F1 to bring up the help file here, and maybe do a quick search for Arc, and you have these Arc & Design material here, and you can scroll through and go through here and read all of this stuff. but you have basically the same information in one location. If you go to your help file, actually the help file under Autodesk and 3ds Max, I'm using Design 2010, but it'd be the same for 2009 or probably 2008. You have in the help folder the architectural shaders PDF and the production shaders PDF. If you just double click on those, and actually I keep a shortcut on my desktop to these for whenever if I have a question. It's an easy way to get to it outside of 3ds Max. I can just load it up in another monitor here and read through it if I have a question about something. But literally, as I go through here and I scroll down, you can see that it's 117 pages of documentation here that goes through all of the different settings on this Arc and Design material. Now you may think, oh my god, it takes 117 pages to go through this. How complex is this thing? And it's not really that complex. It's just really well documented, and the documentation goes beyond okay, well, set the switch to X to get this. Zap created this and actually went through and explained in great detail what happens when behind the scenes when you actually flip a switch or you change a value, because you can see all the results here in this document. So again, it's not only a document explaining the Arc and Design material, it tells you tips as far as how to do certain tasks like water and liquids, just all kinds of information in here. Really, just spend some time going through this and it will greatly improve your knowledge about not only the Arc and Design material, but a lot of other aspects of Mental Ray and CG in general. Likewise, there's a production shaders document too, and in a similar fashion it goes through and explains all of the production shaders. So those two things, you may want to be sure and check those out. Okay, so getting back here to the Arc and Design material, what I want to look at is just briefly go over if you purchased some textures, how would you set those up in this material, something like the Arrowway texture set. So in a similar fashion to what I did in the Scanline renderer material basics, I'll use these Arrowway textures, and they come with a diffuse, a specular, and a bump texture most of the time. So what I would do if I had a diffuse texture is I want that to go here in the color slot. So I just click this little box and it brings up the material map browser. I'm going to assign a bitmap, so I just click bitmap, and then I go to wherever I have these materials located, and just scroll through and pick whichever one, whatever material you wanted to apply. I'll just go ahead and use this first one, and the D, well, evidently the D stands for destruction in my case, because I had just lost 3ds Max when I tried to select that map. I probably have been running it too long today, but I've restarted and got back to where I was a while ago. And what I'll do is come in and again select bitmap, come here and select the D and keep my fingers crossed this time and hit open. And as you can see, that assigns a diffuse map here to this particular material. Now what I want to do next is just go ahead and assign this material to the object, and there's a couple of ways that you can do that. You can just hold the left mouse button down and drag this over onto the object that you wanted to. You could also select the object like so, and then you have the assign material to selection feature available here in the material editor. So I'll just click that, and this material already has that name, so I'm just going to tell it to replace it, and that material is applied now. You can't really tell because it looks the same. The reason for that is I need to enable that map here, show standard map in viewport, so that I can actually see the texture on this object. And the mapping coordinates are a bit extreme here, so I'm just going to increase that something like 60. And let's just turn off edge faces so that I can see the material a little bit better. Okay. Along with these, you have these particular material or texture maps. You have a specular and a bump map. Your specular map will go here in the color, this reflection color slot. So again, I'm going to come down, I'm going to add a bitmap, and scroll over here to this boards with the S designation for specular, and click OK. If I go back, if you'll notice, it's still rather reflective. If I just copy this and cut, it really didn't change a lot as far as the specular goes here. And the reason for that is that the reflectivity value here is still working in conjunction with this map. So if I turn this off, the reflectivity off, you can see that even though I've assigned a black and white map here, I'm still able to control the amount of reflectivity from this spinner here. And so kind of keep that in mind, that that's I know that's been a question before that I've been asked, how do I assign a map here to control that? And that's how you can still put that in, and it is controlling where the reflections occur, but you can still have some control over the amount of reflectivity. Now, up next is you can set the glossiness of this. Obviously, this particular wood wouldn't be a glossy type wood unless it was like a hardwood floor, but this particular map, you wouldn't want this this extreme amount of gloss on. So what I would do is enable this highlights in FG only mode. And as it sounds, it's basically going to pick up the highlights from Final Gather and from the light sources, kind of like the fake specular, in using a standard material that I talked about in the scanline discussion on materials. And so what I want to do is decrease this glossiness value to broaden out that highlight. And for this particular wood material, you'd want a really broad highlight with that. So you'd want a really low glossiness value, maybe something like 0.1, something like that. And then maybe I'll decrease the overall reflectivity to something like 4, something like so. Okay, and then the final option here for this particular material setup is a bump map. And as you can see, I'm just scrolling down here to get to the bump map under the special purposes map rollout. Again, I'm going to click the none and then go to bitmap. Okay, over here we have a bump map for this particular texture. So I just click that and bring it in, and I want to decrease the blur value on this as well as these other bitmaps if I didn't do so already, because as I mentioned in the scanline material option, this gives you a lot more detail on your materials. So let's give this a render and see what that looks like. Okay, and there's the rendered object here. I went ahead and changed the mapping coordinates a little bit more because it was kind of hard to see the bump detail at that amount of scaling that I had on that object. If you'll notice, there's a discrepancy here between this actual material. Let me move this out of the way. You can see the difference in the rendered output versus how much darker the actual texture is. So in order to adjust that, what I can do, I don't want to adjust the gamma on my scene because it's set up correctly the way that I want it. I can do that locally with a map, and to do that, what I'll do is click on bitmap here, and you can see there's a lot of maps to choose from here. The one that I want to use is the utility gamma and gain shader here. Now before I apply this, let me explain the difference between you have materials, you have shaders, and you have texture maps. A texture map is this, just a bitmap texture. It could be a photograph of a brick wall. It could be whatever that you're applying, say, to the diffuse color of a material. That's a texture map. A shader is like these small little math modules, if you will, like this, for example, this utility gamma and gain shader. That's a shader. So it's going inside of, I'm going to apply this to a material. Okay, so let me just click this, and it's going to ask me if I want to keep the old map as a submap, and I'm going to say yes, because I want to wrap that texture inside this gamma and gain shader, which is in turn inside of this material. So a material is a compilation of shaders, and a shader is like a small math module. So that's kind of the difference between the levels of between it goes texture or procedural map, shader, and then material. So now you can see it's the gamma is wrong here in the material editor, but when I render this, it's going to render correctly. And so that's a lot closer, as you can see, that to the actual, a little bit slow here, the actual texture map here. And let me just pause the video while this finishes rendering. Okay, so there's the completed render. Now, if I close this render, you'll notice that this looks kind of weird. That's an artifact of the gamma and gain shader. It doesn't display well in the viewport, so what I can do is go to the next layer or submap of that gamma and gain shader, which is the actual bitmap, and then click show standard map in viewport, and that brings back the viewport, the correct viewport appearance of this particular texture map. Okay, so now let's go ahead and actually reset this material back to a standard ArcInDesign material, because I just want to look at the transparency, and transparency is similar to it works similar to what I was saying about the reflection, in that I can assign a black and white map to the color here, and I'll just assign a checker map like so. And even though, let me just enable that here in the viewport so that we can see where it is, even though I've assigned a black and white map, the object isn't transparent. This material is not transparent, and the reason for that is because transparency is set to 0. So if I increase that, now you can see I have transparency here on the object, on this material. So again, these two work in conjunction with each other, just like I had mentioned the reflection works with the reflectivity plus that color slot. Okay, so that's, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this. This was just a quick example of how to set up a basic material, and I wanted to point that out about how the reflection, the reflectivity works along with this color slot. Again, be sure to review that document on this particular ArcInDesign material, because it does an excellent job of explaining all of these functions here. And again, I'm not going to go in depth with that because I have a lot more features to cram into this video. So what I want to do next is look at another material here. So up next, another popular one to use is the car paint material. So let me just click that, and this car paint material is obviously it's going to simulate car paint surfaces. So I'll apply that to the object here. Now, one of the things that bothers me about this particular material is that it doesn't show up in the viewport real well, even though I have a red object here. As you can see, it's when it's applied, no matter what I change this to, it's not going to change in the viewport. So that kind of bugs me about that. Whereas if I use like an ArcInDesign material, if I change that, you actually get to see what's going on with that in the viewport. Not so the case with this car paint material. But getting into the car paint material, it's broken up into several sections here. You have a diffuse surface. You can have flakes in here, and I'm just going to roll these up for now as I go through these. You can have specular reflections. Remember, those are like the fake highlights that I was referring to on the standard materials. Reflectivity, how reflective is the material. You can have a dirt layer on top of the car paint itself. And then you have some advanced options here for radiance weight and global weight. These are more geared towards indirect illumination calculations, how this interacts with your indirect illumination. So let's just take a look here at the diffuse options here to kind of break this down, make it a little easier. So to begin, you have a base color here. I won't get into the ambient light because I went over that with the standard materials, what that does. Kind of a fake global illumination or ambient light source here. Most of the times I just leave that black because you can see it change here in the shader ball. So maybe I would want this kind of like a really light color, like so. Now, similar to the edge color, you have a bias setting there. You have a bias setting for the light facing color, and default value is 8. As I increase it, it actually decreases that. Once I go down, you can see at the minimum value, you have a lot of this light facing color. So you probably want to leave that up. Again, the default is 8. You have a diffuse weight. You can increase that. I'm not sure why you'd want to increase that beyond 1, but if you do need to, you can increase the diffuse weight. I would assume that a diffuse weight of 1 would be the physically accurate setting to use. Now, likewise, you have a diffuse bias setting that you can use here to decrease or increase that diffuse amount, if you will. So as you can see, if you break this up into modules, at first it may seem rather daunting, all these settings to look at, but if you just go through and break these up module by module, it's really not that difficult to find your way around and learn what these things do. And so if you can get by without using that, you'll enjoy a faster render time. You have a flake specular exponent option, and that's basically how big of a highlight these flakes will produce. If I decrease that down to 10, you can see that it spreads these out a little bit further, well, quite a bit further than the default setting. Likewise, if I increase that to say 90 or even higher, I get a very small amount of these right around the highlights is where this is going to happen. So generally the flake where these occur, as you can tell, this is specular driven. But however, if you enable the ray trace option, it will reflect the environment. So then it becomes a combination of specular placement with actual reflectivity. So keep in mind, with that off, you need some specular light sources in your scene in order for these flakes to work like you see here in the viewport, where they're placed over these highlights or under these highlighted areas. Flake density, as I increase that, you can see that you have more flakes here. The cap on that is 10, so you can go from 0.1 to 10. I'll just leave that at something like 2. And then you have a decay here. The decay actually kills these off so that it doesn't have to render these, which is especially useful if you're using the ray trace feature. You're going to want to probably use this decay to kind of kill that effect off at a distance, so that you're not calculating those ray traced flake reflections across the entire model. You can put in a value here, and this is a distance from your camera, basically. So you would increase this until you're able to see the flakes occurring on this paint material on your object. So it's kind of a distance-based option here. Below that, we have a flake strength. And as I increase that, you can see this isn't the intensity of the flakes, that's the flake weight. This is the actual flaking, as far as if you think of it as a distance between each flake. If I lower this down to something like 0.1, you can see it's a really tight pattern here. And as I increase that, it sort of spreads out the flakes. So it's increasing the actual flake distance between each other, if you will. So that to 0.5, and then you have a scale, which is the actual size of each individual flake. Obviously, smaller values would be smaller flakes. Larger values will be larger flakes, as you can see there. And you'll probably have to just gauge that by the scale of your vehicle or whatever it is that you're applying this material to. Generally, I end up with some fairly small ones, like 0.1 to 0.05, maybe even 0.01 as a flake scale. Okay, in the next rollout we have specular reflections, and you can assign different colors for these specular reflections. If I come through and put, let's say, red, and this is basically a two-level specular, meaning that one is, you generally want a kind of a broad specular, and then one to be more of a tight specular. So you can't really see the red one here. So what I'll do is decrease the specular weight on this second specular, and decrease that down to 0. And if I increase the weight on this first one, you can see kind of what that's doing now. And the specular exponent just makes that a broad or a narrow specular highlight. Likewise, if I set that to 0 and I come in and change this one to maybe blue, just so that you can see what's going on here, and I increase this value, you don't really see anything happening, and that's because these two are tied together. So I have to have some specular weight 1. So as I increase that, you can see now that I have the second specular up here, whereas I set that to 0, it goes away. So I can set that to 0.5. So generally, you probably want to leave these to white, or maybe just a subtle color variation here. Something like so. And you don't want to increase these too much. But one is a broad highlight. If I decrease this down, you can see how that softens up that highlight versus having a sharp highlight there. So here you have the edge factor, and as you increase that or decrease it, you can see that that's doing away with the edge reflections here. Generally, it's probably best to leave that at the default setting of 7. Below that, you have edge reflection weight. And as you can see, as I increase that, the edges become a lot brighter. So again, it's probably a good idea to leave that at the default setting. And you have a facing reflections weight, which it would be the part of the material that faces you or your camera. So as you increase that, it becomes more like a chrome material. And sometimes I'll decrease that to like 1 or 0.15, somewhere around that range. But the default value is a good value to use there. Now you can do glossy reflections on this material as well, similar to the A&D material, in that you can spread the glossy reflections out, and you can't see anything happen here because I haven't added any samples yet. These two work together. So in order for this to appear to become glossy, I need some samples here. So I'll just plug in 24, and you can see it's really diffused right now. So you have to, it takes a very small amount for this value and to get a diffused reflection here. If I decrease that back to 0.1, you can see it's still rather blurred here, maybe 0.05. So as you can see, you can get some glossy reflections on this paint material, but just remember that these two work together, and if you don't put any samples in here, it will remain a non-glossy reflectivity. You could set it up a max distance value here for the reflections, meaning that it will only reflect objects or calculate the reflections on objects within a certain distance from the material itself, which is useful. Maybe set that to 0.6 and 0.4, 0.5. like so. So now you can see how it puts kind of a dirt effect here on this this car paint material. And of course you could actually come in and assign a different shader here if you wanted to. You could actually put a like a material to shader this particular shader in. And what that would do is, if I wanted to put mud on here, you know, mud could be wet and reflective. Maybe I want to make some A&D mud. So let's go to the A&D material, and this isn't going to be a realistic mud. I'm just going to make this kind of brown looking, maybe like so, and give it some glossiness. And maybe I just want to use that as kind of a mud texture here. So I would just apply that to that material to shader as an instance copy. And so now my mud is also reflective. Perhaps I'd want to put a bump map in here. I can do that, put a bump map on the mud, put a little noise in there, like so. Increase the strength of that. So you can see how that's mixing two separate materials together. That's how you could kind of make a mud material if you wanted to. That's not, don't get me wrong, that's not a realistic mud, but that's just an example to show how you can mix these two materials together. So let's just go ahead and apply this to the object since I haven't done that yet, and just give this a render. Okay, yummy. That's actually quite disgusting looking. But with that, I believe that that's the last thing that I wanted to talk about on this car paint material. So the next material that I want to look at would be, let's take a look here. That was the car paint. The next yellow one, the matte shadow reflection. I'll probably go into that a little bit later. Next, let's take a look at the mental ray material. Let me just close this before I barf. Okay. The mental ray material, if you think about it, think of this as a storage bin of shaders, kind of a universal material here. There's nothing assigned to it by default. That's why you don't really see anything here in the material editor. And if I applied it to our object here and render that, nothing would appear other than that little reflection object that I put in here. Let me just cancel that. So this is just an empty template waiting for you to assign shaders to this. And basically what you look at here is you have a surface shader, which is, as you would imagine, the surface, how light interacts here with the surface of the object. You have a shadow shader. You can assign photon shaders, both volume as well as regular photon. You can assign a bump shader, displacement shader, volume shader, or environment shader. So let's just take a look at the surface shader to begin with. Now you can assign pretty much anything here. For example, one thing, if you wanted to put a bitmap in here, or something like a cellular map, or any of these procedural maps. Let's say I want to put a cellular map in. And what you have to keep in mind is that this does not have, this particular material is a 3ds Max scanline material. It's a procedural material that comes with Max, so it's not a mental ray surface per se. If I render this, the object will not pick up shadows. It'll just produce this as kind of a flat color, as you can see here. And the reason for that is, again, because it doesn't have a true surface shading process going on behind here. This is just a procedural map. So let me just get rid of that. And what I mean by this, picking up shadows and things, if I pick up a true surface shader, something like the DGS material or the dielectric material shader here. I keep saying material, it's actually a shader, I'm sorry. If I pick up, say, this DGS shader, like so, you can see how I get shadows here on the shader ball as well. So let me just make sure that's applied and give this a render. So now I have a true shading surface. I have something that will pick up shadows. It even has glossy controls here, specular controls. So this is an actual surface shader. Again, if you assign something like a bitmap or some of these procedurals, it's you're not going to pick up shadows or have a really good shader surface here. So just make sure that you're using some of these materials here or shaders that are designed to be used as shaders. Now it's kind of hard to tell which ones are which here, because you know, I could assign, you would think maybe some of these yellow ones, but I could assign like I'm going to pick like the metal loom shader here, and that is a true surface shader. I'm just going to tell it to discard, but I found that it doesn't pick up shadows as well. It's kind of like putting one of the 3D maps, like I talked about putting a cellular map in there a while ago. It doesn't pick up like if there was an object casting a shadow onto this sphere, it wouldn't really capture that shadow or work very well with that. So really I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going into this particular, the mental ray shader, because there's a lot of features here, but most of these are dated, and you can do the same thing from within the A&D material, the Arc and Design material, or some of the Pro materials, some of the newer materials that have been made for mental ray, instead of using some of this older stuff, like especially these loom tools. While they still have you know, some good uses, and you can use them by all means if you wanted to, but you can get out of physical accuracy real easy with these, because it's not as limiting on what you can do, and it is a little bit of an older, some of the older shaders in here as well. So be careful when you're coming in, and I would, if you're just starting out with 3ds Max, I really wouldn't get into using this. I would stick to some of the things like the Arc and Design material or the Pro materials. As I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion here, there's only a handful of these that you'll probably use. If I go through and I'll tell you probably this Arc and Design material, the car paint material, the Pro materials here, and the SSS materials, the subsurface scattering materials. Those are the ones that you can pretty much do anything with those, and they're more user friendly than, say, this mental ray material here. Now also, if you notice, there's a lot of duplicates in here. For example, I could come to, let me cancel this, if I come into the mental ray material and go to the surface slot here, I can assign a car paint material, or I'm sorry, a car paint shader. I keep getting those two mixed up. I can assign a car paint surface shader here to the object, and I'm just going to tell it to discard old map. And it's the same identical settings as I wanted with the car paint material here. The difference is that this is a material kind of like a phenomenon, and this is a shader, a surface shader, a car paint surface shader that's plugged into the mental ray material. So why would you want, you know, why would I even consider using something like that if I can just go ahead and use this phenomenon? Well, if you notice, one thing about this car paint material, there's no bump map. There's not an option down here to add a bump map to it. Well, what if I wanted a bump map on this material? I could do that by going into the mental ray material here, adding a car paint shader. Now I have all these other options. I could add a bump map, I could add displacement. So for example, let's just add a bump map here to this particular car paint, and I'm just going to give it some noise here. Maybe decrease that size down to 2. Decrease the intensity a bit. And that's already applied to my object. If I give this a render, I will now have a car paint material with a bump map applied to it. So as you can see, now I have the bump on this material that I didn't have access to over here on the actual car paint material. So it is useful to still have this mental ray material around. That's why you still see a lot of these materials still in here, because they still have uses. And I don't want to see those go away, because it's easy to get in and customize once you learn your way around. But again, if you're just starting out with mental ray, you may not want to dig into this this mental ray particular material here, because it can be rather confusing to see all of these different maps that you can plug in and get the different effects. I guess real quickly, while I'm talking about this material, I'll just describe what these are for. Obviously the surface describes the surface of the material. The shadow here doesn't tell it the shadows that it picks up. This is pertaining to the shadows that this material will create. For example, I could come in here and tell it to assign a glass shader here. And what would happen is, I'll tell you what, let's just unhide this ground plane. And what I will have now is a bumpy car paint material that acts like glass as far as the shadows are concerned. So I will have a transparent shadow down here on this car paint material. So let me just go to perspective mode and zoom out from this a little bit so that we can see this a little bit better. Just render this. So here you can see I'm not producing any shadows off of this object, because you can see them in the viewport. They should be there, but because it's acting like a transparent object on this material now, because it's a glass, it's looking as a glass shader. Now if I take this out, what happens if you don't assign one? It actually uses this surface shader. So if I render this again, you should see the shadows show up now. Okay, so now you can see I have the shadows over here. I forgot that I'm using these two large area lights. That's why it's a really diffused shadow, but you can definitely see that the shadow is there now. The next section here, the caustics and GI section of this material, if you're using caustic photons or global illumination photons, you have to put in a shader here on this material so that it knows how to interact with those photons. Likewise, if you wanted to create some photon volume, you could do that. Again, you have a couple of options here for that. The party volume photon is actually, I guess, the only option that you have here for that. Bump map is obviously what that is, a displacement map. You have some volume options here if you wanted a volumetric shader. And you can assign different environment maps here as well, just like you can with the standard materials. So as you can see, this is a little more complex, even though there's not a lot of options here. Once you get into plugging stuff in, you can get some really crazy results out of this thing. You could, have glass car paint or whatever. So a lot of this stuff, like the photon handling and things like that, if you go to the A&D material, all that stuff is already handled for you. So that's again why I say it's really best to stick with these, like the Arc and Design material, the Pro materials, and the SSS materials here, because those are the ones that will allow you to do pretty much anything that you want to do, especially when you're just starting out. Before I wrap this up, one other thing that I want to mention is that often a complaint that I hear is that, well, I'd love to use the Arc and Design material, but it just doesn't have all the functionality of the mental ray material, where I can assign different things like this. Well, yeah, it does. If you go over to the Arc and Design material, scroll down to the very bottom, you have the mental ray connection rollout. You can see this is the exact same features, settings that you have here on the mental ray material itself. The difference here is that they're locked. They're using this Arc and Design material. But if I wanted to come in and let me just assign this. Let me close that. Let's assign this mud material that I made, and give this a render right quick. So there is the mud surface. Now if I come into the mental ray connection and click this little lock button to the right of it, you can see that, well, I'm right back to just like the mental ray material, where I don't have a shading surface. So I can come in and put like the car paint shader, render that. So now I have a car paint material, even though this is inside the Arc and Design material. So again, you have the mental ray connection here if you needed to modify that, the functionality of that, but that's more of an advanced feature, and you will not, if you're just starting out, don't even don't even bother with expanding this, because it can really get away from physical accuracy by doing stuff like this. So let me just cut that and lock it back, and it goes back to the A&D material. The reason for me showing that was just because I hear that quite frequently, that I want some of the functionality here in the A&D material from that mental ray material, and you obviously have that here. Just scroll down to that mental ray connection rollout. So with that, I'm running short on time here, so I believe I'll wrap this video up. Again, if you're just starting out with mental ray, make sure that you start out with this Arc and Design material, and be sure and check out that PDF file that's in your help documentation. Between the Arc and Design material, the car paint material, if you're just starting out, these are ones that you'll use frequently: Arc and Design, car paint, Pro materials, and the SSS materials for things like skin, lampshades, things like that. I often use these, even though it's a skin material, I'll use it for a lampshade. It's really good for that. So with that, I'll wrap up the video on basics of materials with mental ray.